Today is a special treat. There's a gentleman who lives in Asheville by the name of Gregg Levoy. How many of you are familiar with Gregg Levoy? Wow, so how many of you have never heard yet of Gregg Levoy? All right, you're in for a treat. Gregg is a former professor of journalism with the University of New Mexico. He also formerly worked with USA Today as one of their reporters and writers. He had this awakening, and he'll tell you about that story, so I won't tell you too much about that. But today he travels around the world. He's an author of a couple of books, Vital Signs and Callings, and today he's going to share a message with us based on this profound work of calling. So even though he lives in Asheville, he's usually traveling. So we ask months in advance and always try to get Gregg here at least once a year. Would you please join me with a warm welcome, Gregg Levoy.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I had no idea you had such a beautiful voice either. All right, good morning. Nice to be back, really nice to be back. I think I will jump right in. When I was in college, I learned a critical lesson about human nature from a psychology class that I took. In the middle of the semester, the students in this class pulled a prank on the professor, and we based it on what he was teaching us at that point, which is called classical conditioning. Okay, so most people know about this from the experiment with Pavlov's dogs. Ring a bell? You're on your toes. Well, they were taught to salivate at the sound of a ringing bell. And I read recently that Pavlov's dogs is also the name of a perfume. I mean, that has very interesting implications, especially for the men folk. So what we did is we took advantage of the professor's habit of pacing back and forth in front of the lecture hall when he delivered his lectures. So what we did is that whenever he paced over toward the windows, we very subtly pretended to be bored, okay? So we slouched and we fidgeted and we doodled and we stared vacuously into outer space, which actually by mid-semester it turned out some of us were pretty accomplished at. And whenever we paced over toward the door, we very subtly pretended to be interested, okay? So we sat up a little straighter and we took notes and fixed him with keen scholarly expressions. By the time that day's class was over, we had our psychology professor glued to the door. It was singularly the highlight of my college years. And I half expected that when the bell rang at the end of class, he would begin to visibly salivate. But what I saw in that experience, that experiment, was how incredibly easy, how appallingly easy it is to condition a human being, all right? To steer them from the outside, and by extension, of course, to be conditioned, and without a single word being spoken. The whole thing was done in pantomime, and I figure if it took us, 50 minutes to condition our psychology professor with a whole new set of behaviors, new direction in life, if you will. I tried to imagine the effect on me of a lifetime's worth of that kind of conditioning by the time I was at that point 18. I'm saying thousands upon thousands of messages that all of us got while we were growing up that effectively instructed us in the rules of the game. You know what I'm saying? What is and isn't possible, what dreams are bankable, what dreams are not bankable, how are you supposed to behave in public? What is the definition of success? What are you personally capable of? Just, who pulls the strings in this game and who dances? And I think the cumulative effect of a lifetime's worth of that kind of conditioning, I think effectively forms a kind of hypnosis. I don't even think it matters whether the messages you get are negative or positive. false or true. It's a kind of hypnosis, right? And I think every kind of human community, families, schools, corporations, society at large, passes along the message that conformity is rewarded. Failure to conform is punished. Just a holdover from natural law, I think, because what natural law says is those who leave the herd to go their merry way have a tendency to get eaten. I know it's more complicated in the human arena, but I think that admonition stands. And even though culture itself would not exist if it didn't have the glue of conformity, I just think the individuals in it can pay a pretty steep price for it. And one of the prices we can pay is losing a working familiarity with who we really are. You know what I'm saying? Individually as well as collectively. So when I think of the notion of a calling, all right, a calling to some degree seems to cut through a lot of this conditioning because it emanates from the part of each one of us that knows what it knows, that knows where other people leave off and where we begin, that knows the feel of integrity in our lives and the feel of its absence. And I mean integrity as a psychological issue, not a moral issue. The part of us that knows what kind of decisions it's going to take to make our own lives literally come true. Okay? So, and I'm defining callings, by the way, very broadly, secularly, pluralistically. These are the messages, the signals, even the imperatives that come from deep inside our lives that tell us what it's going to take to stay true to true north and true to the developmental imperatives of our lives. I mean, simply the fact that they change. Our lives change, and so will the calls that come through us. I saw a guy some years ago wearing a t-shirt that had a picture of a man fishing into a lake and a caption that said, "I go fishing because the voices in my head tell me to." And I thought this was actually a great definition of a calling. A calling is something you hear. I mean, in the broad sense of that, hear, feel, sense, know, intuit, ideally have faith in. And I think partly what they're telling us is not to just be most authentically yourself, but follow your deepest enthusiasms. Beautiful word, by the way. Entheos means the God within. All right? So by following your deepest enthusiasms, you are by definition following God, honoring God, expressing God, articulating God, by definition, by following your enthusiasms. All right? I ran across some years ago a college biology textbook, and there was a passage in there that described what happens in a fertilized human egg. And it said that as the cells in a fertilized egg grow and develop really early on in that process, these little indentations appear in the round cell ball that begin the process of distinguishing the head from the hindquarters, okay? Distinction that seems to be lost entirely on some people. 40 years after they're fertilized. But what it said is that if you were to take a cell at that point in the game and from the head and mechanically move it down to the hindquarters, what would happen is it would migrate back up because it knows what it's supposed to become. So I read this passage and I thought, bingo. So do we. I just had that feeling. So do we. We know what we're supposed to become, and maybe at a cellular level. In fact, when I hear people use this kind of language anymore, I feel it in my cells, I feel it in my gut, I feel it in my bones, I feel it in the very fiber of my being. Anymore, I'm thinking, maybe they're talking literally. You know what I'm saying? Maybe it's literal. So one of the people that I included in the Callings book was a artist who lives in Santa Cruz, California. His name is Howard Ikamoto. And he described an interaction that he had one day with his 7-year-old. She came to him and said, Daddy, what do you do at work? And he said, well, honey, I work at the college, and my job is to teach people how to draw. And he said that she looked back at him incredulous and said, Daddy, you mean they forget? I mean, can you imagine how inscrutable that would seem to a 7-year-old kid? Anybody could possibly forget how to draw. How? But the fact is we do forget. And as for how we go about remembering what we already know, let me share this. I did one of my Callings weekend workshops at a conference center in Western Massachusetts some years ago called the Rowe Conference Center. And when I got there, I discovered that there was one other workshop that was being conducted there the same weekend as mine, and that one was on the subject of tracking, okay? And this was thrilling to me because it seemed to me that the two workshops were really about the exact same subject, which was the search for signs, okay? In their case, indicating the presence of animals. In our case, the presence of callings, all right? So I talked to the people from this other workshop all throughout the weekend because we shared meals together in the dining hall. And one of the things that jumped out at me about that bunch was how excited they were just about the signs of the animals. Not even the animals themselves. I mean, frankly, they never saw the damn animals all weekend. It was middle of winter in Western Massachusetts. They never saw them, but I've never seen a group of grown-ups so excited about the subject of poop in my entire life. I mean, this is like all they talked about, including at the dinner table, because it was one of the primary signs they had to go by. But I mention this because I've always wanted to say the word poop in church. I mention it because this was inspiring to me, and I shared it with the people in my workshop by saying, if we could cultivate that quality of enthusiasm just for the hunt, just for the act of tracking our lives and paying attention to them and being in dialogue with them, I think our lives will reveal things to us that they're not going to reveal if we're not interested. They're just not going to give up their secrets if we don't offer them some genuinely devoted curiosity. They're just not. And I think animal tracks are really like signs of any kind. They point to something. They lead to something. If you ever get a chance to read a book called The Tracker by a guy named Tom Brown, this is ostensibly a book about animal tracking, but it's really a spiritual book, and the bookstores actually put it in that section as a rule. And there's a passage in there where he says, a track is the end of a string. At the far end, a being is moving, a mystery that leaves itself like a trail of breadcrumbs. And by the time your mind has eaten its way to the maker of the tracks, the mystery's inside you. I mean, isn't that just a beautiful description of the work of discernment? Just discernment. So when I was interviewing people for the Callings book, one of the things that jumped out at me about those interviews is how many of the people I spoke to told me that they had a practice of some kind, and the whole point of this practice was to strike up a conversation with the maker of the tracks. Okay? This is, in other words, a self-reflective practice, a dialogue with the deep self, if you will. All right? And that seemed to have a lot to do with their ability to discern what their calls were, is just listening, mindfulness and listening. And nothing extravagant either. These are not complicated practices. Daily journaling, probably the most common. Meditation. For some people, therapy as a self-reflective practice. Contemplative reading. So that in addition to reading, the Citizen Times or Time Magazine or professional journals, you're also reading wisdom books. So in other words, books about the bigger picture. So what they're saying to me is, I have one foot in the outer world and one in the inner at all times. One in the material world and one in the sacred. One devoted to the tasks of competence and one devoted to the tasks of authenticity. All right? Dream interpretation was a really common practice. Regular short retreats, especially going armed with a particular question. It seems like it's at the heart of your journey, was another one. Your participation in any kind of group whose members get together for the primary purpose of waking up. So women's groups and men's groups and mastermind groups and personal boards of advisors and even 12-step groups. So here's a sort of a non sequitur. The new book, A Vital Signs. I have a section in there where I talk about talkaholism. Okay. And there was one of the guys that I interviewed for that section who swore that there's a 12-step group for talkaholics. And he said it's called On and On Anonymous. Isn't that great? I have no idea whether it's true, but I used it. I wish there was such a thing. So one of the things that these dialoguing practices can help you do is answer what I think of as the great vocational question. All right? And that, to me, is not what should I do with my life. It's not what do I want to be when I grow up. It's not what major should I declare. It's who am I? I think that's really the great vocational question. Who am I? What is my true nature as distinct from everybody else's? The furry warmth of the herd, And I think these dialoguing practices can also help you avoid, who was it? Joseph Campbell, what he called the great sacrilege in terms of the soul's integrity, which is what he said is inadvertence. The great sacrilege in terms of the soul's integrity, inadvertence. In other words, not paying attention, bumbling along, stumbling along, not having the receivers turned on. Okay? So I think that's fascinating. And so I think, and I've seen this happen, people wait and wait and wait for the great big calling. It's like the bony finger of God. Rather than looking at all the smaller calls that are right at your feet, our feet, which I think of as the fire drills for the bigger ones. You know what I'm saying? A poet by the name of Wallace Stevens once said, I don't ask for the full ringing of the bell. I don't ask for a clap of thunder. A scrawny cry will do. I love that, because that seems like it's really at the beating heart of discernment. So I'll share some of these scrawny cries with you, because they come in a really impressive variety of forms. Calls come as intuitions. An intuition is a little call. All right? It's a momentary call. They come as passions and fascinations and curiosities and gifts and dreams. I mean, all the religions of the world seem to agree that dreams are one of the primary channels through which the gods and the goddesses speak to the mortals. Remember Tom Robbins, the author Tom Robbins? He said, dreams don't come true. They are true. When we talk about our dreams coming true, we're actually talking about our ambitions. Right? And I ran across a study out of Johns Hopkins University that's a corroboration for that idea. What they did is they studied pregnant women. And they found that of the women who had an intuition about the sex of their baby, they were correct 71% of the time, which I thought was fairly impressive all by itself. Of the women who had a dream about the sex of their baby, they were correct 100% of the time. It's a Johns Hopkins study. 100%? I mean, what does that say? I mean, we've got access to really deep knowledge in there, and we're sleeping through it most of the time. So here's some other categories. Callings come through song lyrics you can't get out of your head for weeks. You know? Anybody heard of a novelist named Ann Tyler? She wrote, among other things, The Accidental Tourist. Okay, made into a movie with William Hurt. She says, I can always tell what my husband is really thinking by the tunes that he absent-mindedly hums in the car. You know, I'm in the mood for love is really different than tied to the whipping post. You know? And the first time I noticed this in my own life, I was I think I was about to make an impulsive career decision. And for a couple of weeks, right around that period of time, I kept hearing one line from The Wizard of Oz, repeated day and night. If I only had a brain. Obviously, I wasn't thinking it through, you know, that's the point. So that's one of the forms that they come through. They also come through conversations that you overhear in a restaurant or something, a laundromat. It seems like, that seems to address me somehow. Or, let's see, how about the patterns in your life? You know what I'm saying? You've sort of worn a footpath to and from some issue over the years or decades. Lesson you've endlessly had to learn. That's a call. Kind of mistake you continually make. Kind of partner you continually attract. Getting fired again. You know? Section of the bookstore you always walk into first when you walk into a bookstore. You know, there are patterns. They come through things like, where is there friction in your life? Friction, you know? Because I think it's like in the natural world. Friction occurs where changes are trying to take place, or are taking place, you know? So where does heart argue with head? Where does walk not quite match talk? Where do you fight with people routinely? What is that about? What are you after? You know, so where is there friction in your life? They definitely grow out of wounds and tragedies. Gene Houston said, retell the story of your life with the wound as the middle of the story, not the end, which I think is beautiful advice. And when I say tragedies, I mean those kind of events that just give you your life's work. You know, determine from that moment on what it is you have to say to the world. And of course, in the process, splits your life right down the middle, you know, into BC and AD. You know, the time of your life that came before the crisis, the illness, the accident, the divorce, the death, and the time that came after it, right? Calls definitely come through the body. I mean, I've got a whole chapter in the Callings book called The Language of the Body, because the word symptom means a sign. Of what? The word pathology means the logic of pain. What's the logic? You know what I'm saying? Who was it? Arnold Mindell. I interviewed him for both of my books. He started something called process-oriented psychology, and he's a brilliant body-mind guy. And he said in one of my interviews, he said, symptoms are usually dreams trying to come true, which frankly scared the hell out of me when I heard that. And I didn't know what to make of it until I went to, just like within a week of that conversation, I went to a writer's conference to present in Albuquerque, and after the presentation, I'm out in the lobby, and I'm chatting with people, signing books, that kind of stuff. This woman walks up to me out of the crowd, a total stranger, and says one of those things that people won't generally say to you unless they're pretty sure they're never going to see you again. She said, just walked up to me, she goes, hey you know why I'm so fat? It's not a question you're supposed to answer. And she said, and before I could gather my wits, she answered the question. She said, it's because I have so many stories that I'm not writing down. And I thought of Arnie. I thought, look at that. Symptom is dream trying to come true. I mean, there's no science or philosophy I'm aware of that could dispute a self-diagnosis delivered with that kind of certainty. You know what I'm saying? The woman knew her body was trying to tell her something, and she knew exactly what it was. You know? It was the mark of Jonah. It's really what it was. It was the evidence of her flight from a calling. All right? And one, in this case, that literally pushing out from inside of her. I mean, that's the language, actually, that she used. Pushing out from inside. So, I will wind up with this. I used to be a reporter for, among other papers, the Cincinnati Enquirer. And one of my favorite stories in all the years that I was there was a story I did on the circus coming to town. This was Ringling Brothers. And in a fit of journalistic zeal, and therefore short-sightedness, I let the animal trainer convince me that riding bareback on an elephant at the head of the Barnum and Bailey Circus Parade through downtown would add color to my story. So the only way to get up onto the elephant was to use a ladder, okay? And the only way to stay up there during the parade was to hang on to the elephant's ears, okay? So those of you who have ridden bareback on elephants, you probably know about this already. But elephant ears have a really unpleasant habit of flapping a lot, especially when they're hot. And you know, we're talking about elephant ear flaps here. You know, this is not like kitty cat twitches. So the only way to stay up there during the parade was to remain extremely flappable. You know, seriously, otherwise I would have been thrown. And it was, 12 or 15 feet to the ground. And in front of everybody. And I have to picture here, too. I'm the first thing anybody saw in that parade. I'm pretty sure I did not capture the theme of the show, which is, the greatest show on earth, right? But in looking back on that experience and on what I've learned since then about what's involved in following a calling, I think of that experience, and it has a lot in common, in the sense that I was caught by surprise and carried off by something much bigger than me, in that it was thrilling and nerve-wracking simultaneously, and in that the elephant couldn't have cared less. And what I mean by that is I've discovered this really unsettling truth. My soul does not seem to care what price I have to pay to follow my calls. This seems like a design flaw to me, frankly, but it's not. It seems like it ought to care, but my happiness, my security, my popularity, my vanity does not seem to matter to it. It's just not interested in whether I live a comfortable life. It's not interested in whether people like me. It's not interested in whether anybody says thank you. Although what does seem to matter is hanging onto the elephant. You know what I'm saying? Being willing to go for the big ride. The one that ensures that someday if my life happens to be flashing in front of my eyes, at the very least, it will hold my interest. I want at least that much, I want at least that much out of it. So I just want to wind up by saying, in the spirit of, ensuring that it does hold your interest, I just want to say that the workshop this afternoon, 1:30, is a very hands-on opportunity to explore what your own life is calling for from you at this particular point in time, and what wants to emerge. All right, it's a very gentle but a very straightforward process of exploring what wants to emerge at this point. So I hope you'll come. And once again, thank you, Darlene, and thank you, Christy, for pulling this together at all, and thank you guys for inviting me. I appreciate it. Thank you. Woo. Thank you.
Greg.